In this lesson, we are going to be continuing talking about the establishment of communist rule as part of our studies in Edexcel A-level history concerning Mao's China. Now, the specification requires us to understand the aftermath of the Civil War. This took place in the previous video when we talk about the state of China in 1949. And then it continues and asks us to examine the state of China's industry, her agricultural position, as well as the position of her national infrastructure. Now, of course, we have to think about the economy, essentially, of Mao's China at the point at which the Civil War has ended, and we have to bear in mind the fact that from 1937 to 1949, China had been embroiled not only in a civil war from 1946 to 1949, but also the Sino-Japanese War and the Japanese invasion and occupation of Japan beginning in 1936. And so these two events and these two factors make it very clear that the industrial, agricultural, and infrastructural base of China's economy is particularly poor at this point in time. Beginning first in thinking about the destruction of the Chinese industrial base, we have to think about the fact that the industrial sector was gravely affected by both the Sino-Japanese War and Japanese occupation between 1937 and 1949, as well as between 1946 and 1949, the Chinese Civil War, 37 to 45, I apologize. During Japan's occupation of China, many industrial centers, especially those that were in the eastern coastal regions, were either destroyed or were repurposed not to serve the Chinese economy, but to serve, of course, the Japanese war efforts. Cities like Shanghai, for example, which at the time was one of China's largest industrial centers, would start to suffer from very heavy damage, including destruction of their factories, of their railroads, and their ports. Of particular importance for the Japanese was, of course, Manchuria, a region that was rich in natural resources and was a significant industrial base under the Japanese-controlled Manchukuo. Ultimately, when we see the Japanese withdrawing in 1945, of course, the events of early August 1945, essentially bring about the end of the war in quite spectacular fashion. You have the dropping of the two atomic weapons on the 6th and the 9th of August, respectively. And in between that, on the 8th of August, you, of course, have the Soviet Union's invasion of Manchuria, all of which results in a spectacular collapse of the Japanese empire. But we could see that after the Japanese withdrew after 1945, much of this infrastructure was already in ruin, and this would be only the first part of the series of events which causes the further economic collapse of the Chinese economy. Because, of course, following 1945, and as we go into 1946, we see a civil war begin to break out between the nationalist parties, the KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. The KMT had control over many of China's largest cities, but as the war continued to drag on, these industrial sites were frequently targeted as a way to weaken the control of the nationalist position, which of course was a position that the Chinese Communist Party went for. In some cases, industries would then shift more towards the interior of China, away from some of the more heavy fighting zones, but this did very little to prevent the long-term damage. And so ultimately, when we think about the position of Chinese industry, should I say, by 1946, Chinese industries had operated at about approximately 20% of their pre-war capacity, producing only about 25% of the output compared to before the war. So we can see a real complete decimation almost of the industrial capacity of the Chinese state. At the time the CCP's victory takes place in 1949, then, China's industry was very underdeveloped. By comparison, we can see that China's industrial production fell far, far behind that of Western standards, which, with a limited capacity of manufacturing for essential goods, the total industrial output, particularly in heavy industries, was ultimately inadequate for the needs of the state. We can see ultimately that there are there's clearly 20% towards pre-war levels, and at the same time, we can see that according to a report by the United Nations Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East in 1951, China's industrial production and industrial output was primarily that of light manufacturing. So producing goods like textiles and food products, with things like steel production and machinery, the sort of heavy industry, being very, very minimal. In 1949, for example, China had very few industrial plants that were capable of producing any kind of high-quality machinery or motor vehicles or durable goods. So cities like Shanghai, that were the sort of last vestiges of industrial output, became a hub for textile and light manufacturing. Despite land reforms as well, food production was approximately 30% below pre-war peak levels due to the devastation that was caused by the years of conflict. And so when we think about essentially trying to feed heavy industry, trying to feed the workforce of a heavy industry, this also contributed to the fact that there is just clearly a lack of any kind of valuable resources that would be available for producing high quality industrial output. This then meant that agriculture was the most important part of the economy. The dependency on agriculture meant that in 1949, agriculture accounted for as high as 60% of China's total social output value, i.e. The kinds of things that everybody in China was doing. 60% of everything that was being done was agricultural in nature. And so the dependency on agriculture was very, very important. We can see that one of the major issues in post-war China when it comes to agriculture is the fact that there is an unequal land distribution and feudal practices. We see that post-war China was in extreme inequality when it came to land distribution. The landlord systems, the landlord class, controlled vast tracts of arable land and left millions of peasants in poverty and dependence on feudal systems. In many regions then, peasants had to pay exorbitant rents and taxes, which then of course trapped them in cycles of poverty. When we think about the Chinese population then, according to some estimates from the national government in a little bit earlier than the end of the Civil War, but in 1947, at the sort of peak of the Civil War, between 70 and 80% of China's population were peasants. Most of them were living in rural poverty. The richest 1% of landlords owned as much as 70% of all the land in some of the regions. This is a vast disparity and inequality when it comes to the ownership of land, which fueled support for communist reform. It fueled support for the communists in the countryside who promised land reforms and promised land redistribution. And it is these kinds of land reforms that we see being one of the top priorities of Mao when he takes control in 1949. The new government introduced land redistribution policies that aimed to break up some of these very large estates that were owned by the wealthiest class within society. The land reform was seen as a crucial part of the appeal of the Communist Party. Everybody liked the idea of land reform. We can see that in the years following 1949 then, these land reforms began to take place. Mao's approach was not just about land redistribution, but he was also wrapped into the broader ideological idea of class struggle. And landlords were often subjected not just to having their land taken off them, but they were often subjected to violence, public trials, and execution. We see that some estimates suggest that by 1953, the CCP had consolidated as much as 47% of arable land to the peasantry, although overall agricultural productivity would still remain low, and we'll get to looking at agriculture within Mao's China in future lessons. But ultimately, we can see that there are still major challenges, including low productivity, the fact that ultimately there was not as much being done with the land that was being made. Most Chinese peasants would use traditional farming techniques, relying very heavily on manual labor and very simple tools, and had not, in fact, embraced some of the newer, more Western technological ideas that might have made agricultural production more productive, as it would be. China's grain yield per hectare in 1949 was far below the global standards. The yield of rice and wheat per hectare was among some of the lowest in the world. Little mechanization and very limited access to modern agricultural techniques is what fueled some of these poor results. And then finally, you can also throw into this fact that there would be, as the result of poor harvest, famines and food insecurity. Natural disasters as well, like floods and droughts, often led to a very inefficient agrarian system, something that we'll get to in future lessons' time as well. Finally then, let's think about the idea of infrastructure, transportation, and energy supply. Energy supply is one of those major issues that really crops up towards the end of the Chinese Civil War. Beginning first with transportation systems, we can see that ultimately both the Japanese occupation of China since 1937 and the civil war that takes place from 1946 onwards completely destroys the infrastructure and transportation networks within China. Roads, railways, ports were in ruins. That both of these factors, the Japanese and the Civil War, caused widespread destruction of very key transportation hubs. We can see that in the years leading up to 1949, much of China's rail network was completely destroyed. You can see that by 1949, broadly speaking, China had constructed or had within her state roughly 25,000 kilometers of railways. That's how much that there was, but only about 9,000 kilometers were in any way operational. And of those 9,000, it was primarily in the northeastern part of the country and also in Taiwan, which of course breaks away after the Chinese Civil War ends. So we can see just how devastating the amount of infrastructural destruction we start to see. When we think about port facilities such as that of Shanghai and Tianjin, these were also damaged as well. The lack of infrastructure in these rural areas made it very difficult for the mobilization of resources. But if transportation was poor and transportation was a major problem, so too was energy supplies and communication supplies. By 1949, we can see that China's energy sector was majorly underdeveloped. Not only was it underdeveloped, but then it also had to deal with the fact of, as I've mentioned already, the Japanese occupation and the Chinese Civil War. So an already underdeveloped energy supply system, a deficient energy supply system, was further destroyed by the impact of these two conflicts. Most of the energy infrastructure was focused on coal and wood, with very little development in oil, in electricity, or any kind of other modern energy resources. And we can see then that energy production, electricity production specifically, is very minimal. We can see that many regions relied on traditional forms of energy, such as wood and coal, for heating and for cooking. The lack of an energy grid hindered the industrial production and economic development of China. And then finally, we can see that, again, a very primitive system of telecommunications compared to the global standards. We see that the country's telephone network was very limited, especially as we get to rural areas where very few had access to modern communications technologies. And so ultimately, if we were to conclude this lesson, you'd see that the state of China in 1949 was particularly poor. China's economy was in a disarray, essentially, and it took the Chinese Communist Party to not only implement new agricultural and industrial policies, some of which were mildly successful, others were very, very disastrous, but they also had to involve themselves in quite a lot of political repression. The next lesson is going to think about the power structure in China and think about the Chinese Communist Party, how it worked, what it looked like, who were some of the key players, and why this then started to develop into a situation where we start to see quite a lot of political repression, which we'll get to in future lessons as well.